Hey everyone, welcome to Running Retro. So today we're going to be firing off a new series called Through Rose-Colored Glasses, where I look at my favorite games and try to critique them, even though in my head and my heart, they're everything I could want. Either be circumstances just around playing them where they caught me at the right moment, the right time, and they struck that chord, or the gameplay was so good it sucked me in and just made me fall in love with the game immediately. Whichever it is, it can be really hard to look at those games and criticize them when they hit those points with you. So I'm going to start disassembling my views of those games and see if I can take a far enough step back to look at the games critically. And we're going to start with Metroid 2. So, this is the second Metroid in the series. It was released on the Game Boy, and it's the sequel to the original Metroid on Nintendo. And because it was released on the Game Boy, it does have some things right out the gate that are problematic. The grayscale on the Game Boy can be kind of hard to look at. It's a little bit harsh on the eyes, and the sound is a little bit rough because of it being Game Boy sound. Both of these issues can be somewhat addressed by playing it on the Super Game Boy or the Super Game Boy 2 or the GameCube Game Boy player. Basically, if you're playing it on any way except for the original Game Boy, those problems can be mitigated to a certain degree. The sound still isn't the best, but the colors can be made a lot better, and it can actually look like a very decent Metroid game, as you can see looking at our capture off of a Super Game Boy 2. Now, one of the huge problems that people talk about every time they mention this game is there is no map. And if you've played Super Metroid, that's probably going to be a huge problem for you. And for a lot of people, it's a deal breaker. But there's something really important to remember with this. The Metroid on the original Nintendo didn't have a map either. So the idea of a map in this game hadn't really come around yet. And people always look at this game through the lens of Super Metroid rather than through the lens of the original Metroid. And while there is no map and that is a problem, that doesn't strike me as large of a problem just because it's following on the footsteps of its predecessor, and that was something that just hadn't that was an innovation that hadn't come around yet, and that's one of the things that Super Metroid really improves on. That said, the lack of a map in this game can be very, very frustrating, and it can deter people a lot. However, that lack of map creates for a more linear Metroid game. And this is one of those things, too, that people don't really like, because Metroidvanias are supposed to be wide open, where you're going back and forth, trekking through the same areas, finding new things. You definitely trek through the same areas in this game, but you very rarely find new things. Most of the items you're going to find are all clumped together, and they're sections of massive discovery and little exploration. And that's partially because of no map. I think that was intentional game design where they were trying to head that off of the pass. Unfortunately, it also creates another problem in that you get power-ups in a lot of chunks. So you don't get that satisfaction of going through and finding little tidbits all over the place. Instead, you find a lot of nothing, and then you find a lot of everything, and then you find a lot of nothing again. And while that doesn't ruin the game, if there were better placement and they had a map, then there would be a lot more opportunity for you to find items sprinkled throughout rather than in those clusters. And another problem with that is it can be easy to get lost. Because there are so many rooms that look really similar, it can be a little confusing, a little disorienting when you're trying to figure out what you're doing and where you're going. This is actually something to the credit of the game, though, as well, because as you're going through these rooms, and they're so similar, as you're trying to figure out where you're going and getting lost at the same time, turned around and backwards, that feeling of isolation and sort of a creepy atmosphere sets in. And even though it can be frustrating, when the music, being its natural Game Boy self, lends to a somewhat monotone sound, you can get a real vibe of this alien world this ruined civilization and having no idea where you're going and being very alone and very vulnerable. It's still not a good trait, but the developers did a really good job of taking the limitations that they had and using those to augment the atmosphere of the game. So it's a bad quality with good usage. The power ups, though, are what really open this game up and also start to make it fall apart a bit. You get some of your really iconic power ups, like the space jump, the spring ball. These things are great, and they establish a large portion of the future Metroid series. But at the same time, you don't get stacking upgrades for your main weapon. So if you want Ice Beam, you have to pick up Ice Beam and avoid all the other upgrades in the game. Like in Super Metroid, they stack, so you can have the Ice Beam plus the Wave Beam, and you just keep getting more and more powerful. That doesn't happen in Metroid 2, and that definitely takes something away from it. But you do start with the ability to duck, which you didn't have in the first game, so if something was shorter than waist high, you couldn't shoot it. You had to bomb it or jump and shoot it from a lower point. You can also jump and shoot down, which you couldn't do in the original Metroid. So your movement options are greatly expanded, and that expands the ability of your weapons as well, if you think about it, because it gives them a whole new dimension. And you also start with the long shot. So in the original Metroid, you only had a short shot to begin with, which went about a third of the screen. Now you shoot the whole screen. However, your shot is really narrow and it can be very difficult to actually hit enemies. So, actually interacting with your enemies at the beginning of the game is a lot tougher than it was in the original Metroid. And that's actually a step back. And they figured that out in Super Metroid, where your shot has a slightly larger hitbox. It's still weak, but it's actually a useful weapon. It's not really the case in Metroid 2. Health and missiles are also more meaningful. They're more common. So in the original Metroid, you had a lot of problems with getting drops. If you needed health or if you needed missiles, then you would have to farm for quite some time to get any meaningful upgrade to your stash. And they fixed that in Metroid 2. They also fixed when you start with the health that you ended your last play session with. So those are two nice things, but they are offset by a couple other problems. When you get this spider ball, it's really easy to accidentally morph into it. If you just want to be the regular morph ball and move quickly across the screen, you're likely to press down an extra time and turn into the spider ball, and that slows you down a lot. It can be a little bit frustrating. Also, because of how few pixels are on the screen and how small the screen is, when you get the bomb upgrade mixed with the spider ball, it can be really, really easy to accidentally get caught in your own explosion. Basically, you have to put the bomb at the very edge of the screen if you don't want to get hit. And the spider ball, while a great upgrade, comes with a real problem when you're on corners, because you just press up, left, down, or right in the direction that you want to go. But if you're not on a flat surface, it can be really, really difficult and frustrating to figure out what direction you want to hit. That's mitigated a little bit by once you start rolling, if you keep holding down the direction that you're currently holding, you will continue to roll in that direction, or in the direction that you originally started rolling. So you don't have to adjust based on the surface, but the fact that it can be so difficult to get started, especially when you do have to be stuck to a wall and bomb it sometimes, that can be really frustrating. And the last problem with Metroid 2 is it's really easy to get juggled. Some enemies, especially the Zeta Metroids, will hit you and then move into your hitbox and hit you again, and you just keep getting pushed back. Now, you can take damage boosts where after you get hit, you get to jump again, and that helps a little bit, but there are definitely times later on, especially where you get hit and then you don't have an opportunity to jump because you just get hit again. So that can create situations where you kind of lose control over Samus, and it can be a real problem. But overall, that's more towards the end of the game, and that's more difficulty at the end of the game. I would argue personally, though, that it adds an artificial difficulty to the game rather than just making the Metroids harder. And that's the last thing here is that if you're playing the final Metroids, they're going to hit you. They are designed to get in your hitbox and body you. And while that's fine to a degree, in this case, it feels like it was a limitation on the system and a limitation in the game where they couldn't make the enemy hard enough or intelligent enough to attack the player strategically. So instead they just have the enemies dive bomb you and try and get in your face. And that really does take something away from the game, and it takes something away from the challenge as well, because once you figure out how to mitigate that a little bit, it's not like you're out fighting the enemy, it's or outsmarting the enemy. It's really just that you figured out how to not have the enemy walk into your face. So it's probably due to a limitation, but that doesn't take away from the effect it has on actual gameplay. So at the end of the day, because of how much I like Metroid 2, I think I'm always going to look at it in a favorable light. No matter how many times I look at the faults of the game, they don't bother me. They don't detract from it. I recognize that they're there, they affect my gameplay, but the overall joy of the game stays the same. So maybe this one is too close to my heart, or maybe it really is a good game. It seems like the developers took what was bad about the game or what was a drawback about the game, and they did their genuine best to make it a positive instead of a negative. And I think overall they succeeded. Sure, there are the usual problems, there are the usual irritations, the usual nuisances, but none of those are so bad that they just make the game bad, in my opinion. So if you haven't checked out Metroid 2, go take a look. It's a genuinely good game in a kind of an awkward shell, but that shell gives it a lot of charm, and it's really smooth and fun. It's also relatively short, so you can just pick it up and have a good time with it. So at the end of the day, please let us know down in the comments below if you think that this game is good and it is a hidden gem and it's one of those underappreciated games, and that the rose-colored glasses aren't actually making us see a good game where there isn't one, or if we've actually managed to set them aside and look at the game objectively for its faults and its perks, and it is genuinely a good game at the end of the day. And as always, if you haven't, please like and subscribe. Check us out on Thursdays and Fridays for our streams. This week in particular, we are on vacation, so we will not be streaming this Thursday or this Friday if you're watching the video on its release date. But we will be next week, and we will be diving into some more Metroid 2, trying to get a better time on it, as well as some Mega Man X and some Super Ghouls and Ghosts. So come check us out and let us know if there's anything else you would like to see in the comments below. Thank you all for watching.